Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease. So it's a non-communicable, non-catching disease that you are born with. Cystic fibrosis is when the cell membranes don't function properly. They produce a particularly thick, sticky mucus. And this thick, sticky mucus can clog up all sorts of areas in the body. So, for example, it can clog up the lungs and make it very difficult to breathe. Cystic fibrosis is a recessive disease. That means that of the two different versions of the genes, those are called alleles, the dominant version makes your cell membranes work normally. But the diseased version is on the recessive, the little c. So if you have the recessive gene, you might have the disease, you might not. And now I've drawn these as a C plus and then just a little c. You don't have to do a little plus to show that it's a capital letter. Some letters are very obvious that they are capitals, but C's are very similar, and in a rush it can be unclear to the examiner. So you don't have to do it, you won't lose marks, but it's a good tip. There are 3 possible combinations of alleles, the genotypes that you could have. So you could have big C and another big C. You could have big C, and little c, little c. Now because this is recessive, when we get to the middle one, things are a bit complicated. If you've got 2 copies of the normal allele, you are going to end up having a normal functioning cell membrane, so you don't have the disease. Skipping the middle one for a second. If you've got 2 copies of the cystic fibrosis gene, obviously that means that you're going to have inherited the disease. Because this is recessive, things get interesting when we get to the heterozygote. Remember, a heterozygote is when you have a big letter and a little letter, 2 different ones. When you have a big and a little letter, you don't have any symptoms, but you are known as a carrier. That means that you could carry the disease to your children. Even though you are not sick, you haven't got any symptoms at all, you could pass it on to your children. So cystic fibrosis can happen and can occur from 2 parents that don't have cystic fibrosis, and they may not even know they have it in their family. What we've got on the left here is called a Punnett square. This is an example of a genetic diagram. So in the exam, if you have an exam question that says, please use a genetic diagram, this is what they mean. And they work in the same sort of way as a multiplication grid. So this grid here, we're going to have C plus, C plus. In this one, C plus, and from there, little c, C plus, and then C plus, little c. Now, that isn't complete yet. We now need to interpret what this means. Now, when we want to work out what's happening in terms of percentages, there are 4 options. That box, that box, that box, and that box. So each box is 25% by itself. So we've got this as a combination, C plus, and it's in 1, 2 boxes. So you can represent that as 2 out of 4, or half, or 50%, or any simplification that you want. And 2 of the boxes, C plus, little c, are like that. You don't need to simplify your probabilities as long as you are showing that it is that. If you want to do it as a decimal, fine. If you want to do it as a percentage, fine. I have deliberately not simplified them because you won't need to, and it prevents any errors from taking place. Now what you do, however, is you need to tell the examiner that you know what these genotypes mean. So if you've got C plus, we look it up here if you can't remember, and it means that this individual has a normal, fully functioning cell membrane, so they wouldn't have any symptoms. C plus little c is going to give us a carrier. So this person also doesn't have any symptoms, but they could pass it on to their children. So in this combination, half of them have no chance of passing this on to their children, and half of them do, but none of the children are actually affected. In this situation, things are a little bit different. we have two heterozygotes. So one of the parents is big C, little c, and the other parent is big C, little c. Neither of these two individuals would know, or are unlikely to know, that they could pass this on to their children. So we'll fill it in again. C plus, C plus, C plus, little c, C plus, little c, little c, little c. And again, we need to write down what combinations we've had and show how much of it we've had. So we've had C plus, C plus. We've had C plus 1, little 1, little 1. And again, of that box of 4, that is the total amount available. Now I'm going to do these as a percentage this time to show you how that would work instead. So I've got one box out of my 4 as big C, so that's going to be 25%. So 25% is our dominant homozygote. And on that person, that 25% is going to be normal. All of the cell membranes will be completely functional. I've got 2 boxes out of 4, so that would be 50%. And these would be our carriers. So again, they're not going to have any symptoms, but they could pass them on to their own children. And we have one box here, which is little c, little c. So that's going to be 25%. And that box represents a 25% chance that the offspring would have cystic fibrosis, and they then would have their own symptoms. So cystic fibrosis is a recessive gene. It's a disorder of the cell membranes. If you have a heterozygote, they are a carrier. Only the homozygote recessive, which means little c, would actually have the disease. If you ever have a copy of the capital letter, then you wouldn't have this disorder. You might find in some occasions that this is written with F's for fibrosis instead of C's. Because F's look quite different to each other, you don't really need to have a plus. And this is another way of drawing this. With C's or with F's, doesn't matter. Recessive disease, the heterozygote is a carrier, and it's a disorder of the cell membranes.